Imagine opening your kitchen cupboard and finding it nearly empty, not because you're poor, but because your country is at war. You have money in your pocket, but money alone can't buy you sugar, meat, or even a pair of shoes. For that, you need something more precious than cash. You need stamps. Small paper stamps printed in red, blue, and green. Stamps that determined whether your children would have butter on their bread, whether you could drive to work, whether your family would have enough to eat. These weren't postage stamps, they were rationing stamps. And between 1942 and 1945, they governed every American household with the force of law. This is the story of how American families survived on stamps and sacrifice, how they transformed scarcity into creativity, how they turned limitation into patriotism, and how they learned that sometimes loving your country means doing without. On April 27, 1942, the Office of Price Administration began rationing sugar, the first of many items that would become restricted. Within months, the system expanded to include coffee, meat, cheese, butter, fats, canned goods, shoes, gasoline, and even typewriters. Every American received a ration book containing stamps in different colors. Red stamps for meat and butter, blue stamps for canned goods and processed foods. Each stamp had a point value, and each product cost a certain number of points plus cash. Here's how it worked in practice. Let's say you wanted to buy a pound of hamburger in 1943. It might cost 7 red points plus 30 cents. You'd tear out the appropriate stamp, hand it to the grocer along with your money, and that stamp was gone forever. When your monthly allotment ran out, no amount of money could buy you more meat until the next ration period began. The allocations were carefully calculated, but often felt impossibly small. A family of 4 might receive 28 ounces of meat per week. That's just 7 ounces per person, roughly half a typical portion. Sugar was limited to half a pound per person per week. Coffee dropped to 1 pound per person every 5 weeks. Gasoline rationing hit hardest. Windshield stickers indicated your allocation level. An A sticker for non-essential drivers meant just 4 gallons per week. B stickers for war workers allowed more. C stickers for doctors and essential personnel allowed the most. Suddenly, Sunday drives became unpatriotic luxuries, and carpooling shifted from convenience to necessity. American housewives became masters of substitution and ingenuity. Government pamphlets with titles like "Cooking on a Ration" circulated widely, but women developed their own tricks through trial and error. Consider the famous mock apple pie, a recipe that used crumbled Ritz crackers instead of apples. The crackers, soaked in a sugar syrup with lemon juice and cinnamon, somehow mimicked the texture and tartness of apples. To a child who hadn't tasted real apple pie in months, it was close enough to magic. Victory cake contained no eggs, no butter, no milk, all rationed items. Instead, it used vegetable shortening, water, and vinegar. The result was dense and plain, but it was cake, and it represented triumph over scarcity. Meatless meals became the norm several days each week. Beans took center stage: navy beans, lima beans, pinto beans. Women learned to make them interesting through seasoning and presentation. Shipwreck casserole layered beans with rice, tomatoes, and onions. Mock meatloaf combined lentils with breadcrumbs and vegetables, shaped and baked to resemble the real thing. Every part of every ingredient was used. Bacon grease was saved religiously in cans by the stove, used for frying, baking, and flavoring. Meat bones became soup stock. Vegetable scraps went into the stock pot or the Victory Garden compost. Stale bread became breadcrumbs, pudding, or stuffing. Nothing was wasted. Coffee stretching became an art form. Women added chicory root to extend their supply. Some reused coffee grounds multiple times, the brew growing weaker with each pot, but still providing the ritual and warmth of a coffee break. Where there's scarcity, there's always someone willing to profit. The black market in rationed goods flourished despite government crackdowns. In cities, you could find men in alleys selling sugar at triple the legal price, no stamps required. Meat appeared in back rooms of certain shops, available to those willing to pay premium prices under the table. Gasoline ration stamps were counterfeited and stolen, traded like currency in underground networks. The government fought back aggressively. Inspectors checked stores for violations. Propaganda posters warned that black market purchases helped the enemy. One famous poster showed Hitler's face with the text, "When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler." Another declared, "Rationing means a fair share for all of us." Most Americans resisted the temptation. Patriotic compliance was the overwhelming norm, even when it hurt. Women took pride in following the rules, in stretching their rations creatively rather than cheating. Neighbors watched neighbors, and social pressure against black market participation was intense. But the temptation was real. Imagine your child's birthday approaching and you have no sugar for a cake. A woman approaches you in a shop, quietly offering a pound of sugar for $3, 6 times the legal price. Your daughter's face flashes in your mind. The moral calculation wasn't always simple. The majority chose patriotism over convenience. They believed, rightly, that their small sacrifices collectively made a massive difference in supplying troops overseas and allied nations facing far worse deprivation. If victory gardens and war factories showcased American women's contributions, rationing revealed their quiet genius for management under impossible constraints. Shopping became strategic planning. Women studied their ration books like battle maps, calculating point values, planning meals days in advance to maximize stamps. They timed shopping trips to catch deliveries when scarce items appeared. They learned which stores honored stamps most generously, which butchers might include an extra ounce of meat. Trading networks emerged. Mrs. Johnson's family didn't drink coffee, so she'd trade her coffee stamps to Mrs. Chen for meat stamps. Women gathered in living rooms and church halls for stamp parties, swapping rations to meet each family's specific needs. Clothing presented particular challenges. Shoes were rationed to 3 pairs per person per year. For growing children, this was catastrophically insufficient. Women became expert cobblers, resoling shoes with rubber cut from old tires, stuffing newspaper in toes to extend wear. They let down hems as children grew, added patches to knees, transformed dresses into skirts and shirts into aprons. The phrase "make do and mend" became a mantra. Women unraveled old sweaters to re-knit the wool into new garments. They made children's clothes from adult clothing. Flour sacks, which came in patterned fabric, became dresses, underwear, and curtains. Feed companies began printing attractive patterns on their sacks specifically because they knew women would sew with them. Preservation skills saw a revival. Women canned everything from their victory gardens. They learned to render fat, cure meat, make soap from kitchen scraps. Skills their grandmothers possessed, but they'd never needed, suddenly became essential. For children who lived through rationing, memories are surprisingly mixed. Yes, there was deprivation, but there was also adventure, importance, and surprisingly, fun. Many children remember rationing as a game with serious stakes. They took pride in their family's ration books, sometimes decorated the covers, treated them as treasured possessions. Cutting out stamps was a responsibility. They were handling something valuable, something that helped win the war. Betty Henderson, who was 8 in 1943, recalled, "My mother let me be in charge of the blue stamps for canned goods. I had a little notebook where I tracked what we used and what we had left. I felt so grown up, so important. I was helping manage our family's war effort. Children learned creative lessons in mathematics through rationing. If each person gets half a pound of sugar per week and there are 5 people in the family, and a cake recipe needs 1 pound, how many weeks must we save to make a birthday cake? These weren't abstract math problems. They were real-life calculations with delicious stakes. Some children remember the scarcity more painfully. Robert Martinez remembered standing in his first-grade classroom in 1944. The teacher asked what we'd had for breakfast. Kids said oatmeal, toast with margarine, maybe an egg if they were lucky. When she got to me, I had to say I'd had bread with lard and salt. I was so embarrassed, but looking back, half the class probably had the same. Trick-or-treating at Halloween changed. Without sugar for candy, families gave out popcorn balls, apples, pennies, or small homemade treats. Children collected treats in bags made from fabric scraps, saving paper for the war effort. Christmas became simpler, but in some ways more meaningful. With few toys being manufactured and money tight, gifts were often homemade. Wooden toys carved by fathers, dolls sewn by mothers, scarves knitted by grandmothers. Children learned that love and effort mattered more than store-bought abundance. What made American rationing psychologically complex was context. Unlike Britain or the Soviet Union, America wasn't being bombed. Unlike occupied Europe, Americans weren't starving. The deprivation was real, but relative. American factories were running at full capacity. Employment was near total. Wages were rising. Families had more money than they'd seen during Depression years. Yet that money couldn't buy what they wanted. The disconnect was disorienting. Advertising continued showing abundant tables laden with food, but added patriotic messages, save your stamps, or can all you can for victory. Catalogs displayed beautiful dresses women couldn't buy because fabric was restricted. Department store windows showed single shoes, samples of styles, not for sale, since shoes were rationed. For adults who remembered World War I, this was their second experience of wartime sacrifice. But this time, the stakes felt more personal. Sons and husbands fought on 2 oceans. Every can of Spam you didn't eat, every stamp you saved, every mile you didn't drive represented a tiny contribution to keeping those men alive and bringing them home. The social pressure to comply was immense. Being seen buying black market goods could result in neighborhood shunning. Waste became nearly sinful. Women saved bacon grease not just from thrift, but from a sense that throwing it away betrayed soldiers overseas. Yet there was fatigue, too. By 1944, 3 years into rationing, with no clear end in sight, people grew weary. Complaints increased. Small violations became more common. The government responded with propaganda emphasizing that Germans and Japanese were suffering far more, that American sacrifice was minimal by comparison. Family tensions sometimes flared around rationing. A father might resent his teenage son drinking the coffee ration. Siblings fought over who got the larger portion. Mothers bore the emotional burden of saying no, of explaining again why there wasn't enough, of making scarcity seem manageable. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, many Americans expected rationing to end immediately. It didn't. Some items remained rationed into 1946 as Europe recovered, and America helped feed devastated populations overseas. Sugar rationing didn't fully end until June 1947, 5 years after it began. The last ration books were turned in, and Americans celebrated with baking sprees and candy binges that would have been unimaginable during the war years. The skills learned during rationing didn't entirely disappear.
Many women who'd mastered scarcity cooking continued using those techniques, finding satisfaction in thrift and creativity. Victory gardens persisted in backyards for years. The habit of saving and reusing, of making do, stayed with the generation that experienced rationing for the rest of their lives. Children who grew up with rationing often became adults who kept well-stocked pantries, who never wasted food, who viewed abundance with both gratitude and slight unease. They passed stories to their children. During the war, we couldn't just go buy sugar whenever we wanted. The rationing experience shaped American assumptions about shared sacrifice during crisis. It demonstrated that civilians would accept significant restrictions if convinced they were necessary and fairly applied. It showed that creative adaptation could make scarcity bearable.
The rationing books of World War II represented more than bureaucratic restrictions. They were tangible symbols of a social contract. Every American would give up some comfort, some convenience, some pleasure to ensure collective survival and victory. Those small colored stamps, red for meat, blue for canned goods, each carefully allotted and jealously guarded, connected kitchen tables in Kansas to battlefields in France, linked grocery store lines in Georgia to supply convoys in the Pacific. The generation that lived through rationing learned profound lessons: that prosperity is fragile, that community matters more than individual comfort, that creativity flourishes within constraints, and that small sacrifices multiplied across millions of households can change the course of history. Today, when we throw away leftovers, buy food we'll never eat, waste without thinking, we might remember those who saved bacon grease in tin cans, who made cakes without eggs, who went without so that others might have enough. Their sacrifice wasn't glamorous. It won't appear in movies about dramatic battles, but in quiet kitchens across America, armed with rationing stamps and determination, ordinary families fought and won their own battles against scarcity, and in doing so, helped win a war.